Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness. And Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today, we are talking about Donovan's experience with religion and his background and what has happened. So why don't you start, Donovan, by giving us like an overview of how you grew up, because you grew up in Utah, which is like majority of people I think are pretty religious. So what was that like and what was the situation?
Yeah, so let's see. Yep. Grew up in Utah. My parents were fairly young when they had me, like 18 and 19. So I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. All my grandparents are Mormon. My parents split and my dad remarried, and my stepmom was Mormon for a long time. My actual parents, my dad and my mom, were not Mormon. So basically I give that context to say that like most of the time I was sort of like pushed into going to church from one group or another, but it wasn't like dictated down by my parents directly. So I feel like I had a little bit more space than maybe a family that's, the actual parents were religious.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting in the sense that I had enough space to sort of explore and question and sort of figure these things out on my own, but not enough space to not be like to be able to stay home from church and not and it's so prevalent, especially in the community that I grew up in, to not have sort of religion peek through into all facets of life. So I don't know. I guess that's my starting point.
Okay. So when did you decide that like this isn't quite for you?
Yeah, so for me, I was fairly young. I was 12 or 13 maybe. And I didn't really like going to church. It was boring. It's long. I don't like getting dressed up. Like it's a combination of things that I wasn't super interested in. But then it just got to a certain point where I don't know, I guess I was just curious or whatever else. And I was like, okay, there seems to be like a lot of people who are really bought in on this, like a lot of people, and basically everyone around me. And at the time, I was young, so I didn't have experience with other places really. Like I knew Utah was predominantly Mormon, but I didn't really understand what that meant relative to other places. So I was like, okay, basically most people seem to be bought in on this. So like,
Right.
I'll give it a shot. So I was actually like reading and following the rules and doing all this stuff. And I don't think I did it for an extremely long time, maybe a month, maybe. But after that period of time, I was just like, I don't feel anything. Like everyone is saying, oh, you'll like feel it and you'll know that it's true. And like, it was the opposite for me. I'm like, I feel the same. And more, I feel like I know that this isn't true. This isn't doing anything. So, that was at a fairly young age that I sort of figured that out. And I kind of tried to keep my mind open, but more and more as I would try little things, like I'd be like, okay, I'll do this. I'll pray every day. I'll do this. I'll look for this. I'll read this. It just, everything was the opposite of what people were saying that it would be in terms of how I would feel and stuff like that. And I just became really disillusioned with it. And then at that same time, sort of like this like 12, 13, 14, 15 age range, I also started to see like a lot more cracks in other people's facades, right? Like I started to notice them more and just realize like, a lot of these people are saying that they believe this thing and they're acting differently and they don't follow the stuff that they believe, or like, there's like, hey, you should be accepting of people and love your neighbors and do this stuff. And then like, these people over here are gossiping and doing all this. So another piece of it is like I was kind of looking at the outcomes, right? I was seeing what people were supposedly studying and trying to live, and then the outcomes. And I have more compassion now, but at the time I was just like, what the hell? Like these people are supposed to be like working on stuff to make them extra nice, and they're not any less of assholes than anyone else. So like,
Right.
I don't think this is, not only does this not feel correct to me, it's not accomplishing the outcomes that like people are trying to get. So I just don't know if I see the point.
Yeah. Did you, when you were having all these feelings around this doesn't feel right to you and you're not connecting with it, did you ever kind of think that like, is there something wrong with me? Is it me? Am I not getting it? That didn't happen for you?
Nope. I had enough space in my life. It might have been different if my parents were religious, right? Because I have heard those exact sentiments from people, from families that like were completely religious through and through and then couldn't connect with it. Like that, I don't think that's an uncommon sentiment. I just had enough space with my actual parents to not feel like something was wrong. And I also had enough experience with, because my parents weren't religious, so a lot of their friends also weren't. And so I had more exposure to like people who weren't religious. So I didn't necessarily feel like, oh, like I'm screwing something up, but there was a while, like maybe a couple years, where I was like, am I missing something? Like what is the piece I'm missing? And I think now, and this would probably be controversial, but I think now what it is like there is a very valuable sense of community that you can get from something like that.
Right.
And there are also some other things that parallel healthy behaviors, like for example, prayer. And people might not be happy about this, but like prayer is very similar to meditation. Very, very similar. So as I was kind of like looking, thinking about it, and this developed over a long time. This is not when I was a kid, but I feel like there are ways of interacting with religion that you can end up with a lot of positive outcomes that are not necessarily because like that have to be religious, but because they like mirror a lot of those same practices that lead to a happy and fulfilled life. So obviously I didn't know that when I was a kid, but I did for a long time think like, what am I missing? Because a lot of people are super bought in on this. And if it's not working at all, then what the hell are they bought in on?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's, I could see how there could be a lot of positive qualities in having religion. One of the biggest is community. And I think that's beneficial for anyone. It's like being able to connect with others and, have that shared belief system or interest can make the difference. But at the same time, though, if you're in a religion and you leave it, it's almost like you're not just giving up the religion, you're giving up the community potentially. Because sometimes some certain people might shun you for leaving. Do you feel like that was the case for you? Maybe not from your parents, but from other people?
Yes, in the sense that, well, I mean, I directly had it in my family to some degree with some relationships, like when Mormon men typically go on a mission, go wander around and knock doors and try to convert people for a couple years. And when I decided I didn't want to do that, there were some people in my family that like they didn't completely cut me out, but the relationship definitely dwindled quite a bit. Which is interesting that it didn't like impact me quite as heavily as I would have expected. But I guess by that point in my life, I was sort of used to it or prepared for it, or like, yeah, okay, some people just expect you to live a certain way, whatever. But I'll say in the way that it mostly impacted me was in my community. I felt like it was hard to develop sort of like friendships and relationships because people wouldn't want to open up in the same way of like, even now, like if I knew someone was unlikely to share my values, I'd probably have a little bit more like space in my life to actually communicate and figure out if that's the case. But when I was younger, like if I knew someone didn't have my values, I probably would have just been like, oh, like I don't want to spend a bunch of time with them. So that's mostly what I felt, and it wasn't necessarily from like adults or grown people, but like a lot of school and kids and stuff. Like there was a lot of nobody was like mean to me or anything, but the relationships just felt a lot more closed off.
Yeah. And what would you, I mean, it sounds like you didn't have it like as terrible, or you had enough self development or awareness to not let it affect you too much. But what would you say to someone who was like leaving their religion, but like that means getting shunned by their family or their community, like how to kind of deal with those heavy emotions that might come up with that situation?
I actually don't know if I have a very good answer for that because it's not really the experience I had, right? Because my parents weren't super religious, those connections weren't like pinned by that, and also I made friends that were not religious very like early on. Those were the friends that I made. So
Mhm.
I never was really in it. I didn't really feel like I was giving anything up. If
Mm,
anything, I felt like I was like more justified and strengthened in my position of like, no, I don't want to do this.
mm,
Like,
mm.
this is not a good use of my time.
Yeah.
Whereas before it was like, oh, maybe this is good for me, but it just sucks and isn't fun. Like maybe this is like broccoli, like
Mhm.
except I like broccoli. So I don't know how I use that example. But like, so I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's tough
Mhm.
because I didn't experience that. You know, the family member that like was really upset I didn't go on a mission, like we were never super close.
Mm.
And to me, it didn't feel like a huge loss because it was like, if this person doesn't want to talk to me over that, then like I mean, that's their choice. Like I didn't feel like I lost anything.
Yeah.
Um, it is very different for a lot of people who will
Mm.
lose like the ability to be close with like their parents, their siblings, their like neighbors, those kinds of things.
Mhm.
I will say for where I was, you got a lot more just like people being annoying and being like, you should come back to church, you should do this, than actual like explicit judgment of like,
Right.
you're a bad person and I don't want to be around you. Um,
Some people
but
have like disowned their children if
oh yeah,
that happened. I've heard.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's not uncommon. I'm just saying like that from my experience. So
Yeah.
I just don't have a good answer or like good advice because it's not really what I went through. And
Mhm.
my closest friends and the people I knew best were already either off the path to begin with,
Mhm.
or like their parents just weren't religious either. So I don't know. It's got to be tough. I mean, it's basically like starting over. You know, like you will have to develop new relationships outside of that context, and depending on how integrated you are in that community, like that's one of the main reasons I left. I mean, when I moved to Salt Lake, it was better. It was
Mhm.
better enough that it could have been fine, but in like the small town that I grew up, it was a lot tougher. Still big enough town that it's like possible, but you
Yeah.
get much smaller than that, and like you might have to move.
Yeah. Okay, so create an action plan to move where you could be around more like-minded individuals potentially. Although that might be easier said than done, depending on, finances or other situations. And, you might be not around your family anymore, which is something that might be important to you. I could see that being a real struggle for a lot of people. Um,
Mm.
oh, go ahead.
Actually, yeah, before we move on that note, I do know some people who were sort of in the position of not really believing or not being into it, and their family still was very strongly. And like,
Mhm.
I don't, I don't want to say that this is the best path and this is what you should do, but what I've seen most commonly is people just sort of don't bring it up at all. Like, don't bring it to the forefront. Don't say like, oh, you know what? I hate this stuff. I don't believe any of it. Like, this is fake.
Right.
But they also like don't continue going to church with their family. Don't like, by the time you're an adult, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of like
Hmm.
what you choose to do.
Hmm.
So it really depends on what the family is, or the details of how like involved the religion is or whatever else. But a lot of the people I know just sort of like quietly faded out of it without any sort of big like, oh, I'm not into this anymore, oh, I'm leaving, oh, I'm quitting, oh, whatever else. So And I don't know if that's healthy or not, or good or not, but they just never really addressed it. They just sort of let it like fade out. And I guess their family just accepted it or whatever else. I don't know. I haven't heard any like drama around it.
Swept it under the rug or just
Yeah.
didn't quite deal with it. Because I'm sure if it's like, if the family's staying in that particular religion, but someone leaves, it's like, it's understandable for that the family to feel sad about it, but the ideal or the hope was that there's still like love. It doesn't mean that I disown you or I don't want a relationship with you, but it's just going to change things for the dynamic of the family. And it's not about trying to get the rest of the family to deconvert. I don't know. It's just like our other podcast episode on accepting others. It's about just trying to understand and not necessarily change other people, but just allow them to be who they are.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on what you mean by leave too, right? Like there's different levels of leaving, or at least like different ways that you can sort of exit that. Like I guess what I brought up is the most common thing I've seen is people just sort of like slowly stop doing things, right? Like they just stop going to church, or like they just stop having like prayers before meals, and like they just stop doing the stuff until the point that they're like no longer doing any of the things that integrated them. And that sometimes that's for people who, like, if you really question them on it, still believe like at the core they're just not doing they're just not integrated anymore. And then some cases are, they don't believe in any of it anymore. And there is some cases that I saw of people who didn't believe in any of it, but just still continue doing some of the things with a sense of like just community, and like they didn't mind. Like I don't know how this is possible because it would drive me crazy, but like they didn't mind the religious tones, even though they didn't agree with them, because they enjoyed some of the like social and communal aspects so much. So I think I think a lot of it's about getting like really clear on what sort of relationships you want to have, and a lot less about like declaring like I no longer believe any of this is true, and don't ever talk to me about it again. I'm out of here.
Yeah, I could see that makes sense. I guess it varies person to person, and everyone's situations might be a little bit different, but the gradual decline seems to be a thing. But I would say, like, I'm curious about your thoughts about, obviously there's going to be judgments from other people, and people might be worried about like, oh, maybe you're going to go to hell because you're not doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. What do you think like people in those situations might want to cope with that?
Well, I guess, I mean, for me, it's easy because at the point that I don't want to do any of that stuff is the same point that I don't believe any of it. So it's like, it's the same. It's the same as if somebody was like, oh, you better not like jaywalk, you're going to get arrested. It's just like, I'm not going to get arrested. Like, I'm just not. It's not going to happen. I can walk across the street to the park. Everyone will be fine. And I don't know, maybe that's a too flippant of an example, but it's just hard for me to buy into the sort of like judgments and beliefs, and like, or like one example is when I was a kid, or I don't know, 9th grade, 10th grade, something like that, high school. We were talking about we were having a class where we had like some sorts of debates and just opened up topics, and basically the teacher asked if anyone was like not Mormon. I was just like, oh yeah, I'm atheist, and some girl was like, oh, you worship money? And it was just like, like it didn't affect me in any way. Like the rest of the stuff didn't affect me in any way because the baseline position was so far off that I was just like, okay. Like I got a bunch of like judgments and people being like, but what do you think is going to happen after you die? And I'm like, I don't know. And it's like, oh, aren't you like, don't you feel like it's like horrible to not know? And it's like, yeah. So like a lot of the judgments and a lot of the like concerns or criticisms or like problems, I guess, are all things that don't make as much sense or hold as much weight if you already don't hold the belief system, right? Like
Right.
a lot of the things that are brought up are from the belief system. So like if you don't share that perspective, then it's, for me, it might not be the same for everybody, but for me, it's very easy to just like brush it off.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of, this is kind of a tangent, but there's like general conference is what it's called for
Mm-hmm.
Mormons, and it's just like a couple times a year. There's like big gathering. Anyway, there's like people outside of the main temple like protesting abortion,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just like I remember going one time and just being like, "What are these people doing here?" Like
Mm-hmm.
Mormons aren't pro-abortion, so like in the same way, I guess it's just like when your position or beliefs are like so misrepresented,
Yeah.
the criticism doesn't hold any weight. I mean, that was a different example because I wasn't Mormon, but it was just like it's sort of the same thing. Like, oh, like, don't you think you're a bad person and you're gonna go to hell? It's like, well, I don't buy into the belief system, so
Mm-hmm.
no.
Right.
One of the biggest things that I feel like I learned was because most people were Mormon there. Most of the
Yeah.
dating pool was also Mormon.
Right.
So I tried multiple times to like see if that could work with, and I will say that is not a fruitful path. Like if you have such different belief systems for
Mm-hmm.
religion,
Right.
it's extremely difficult, basically impossible to sort of have a productive like romantic relationship, because you can't, like, you're basically building a life together, or trying to, or like that's the long-term goal for most of the time.
Yeah.
And like when your foundations of reality are so different,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty much impossible. I only want to highlight that because if anyone listens to this and is thinking about trying to make that work, it's ridiculously difficult and probably not worth it.
Right. I can imagine that. Yeah. And I think that's really important before you start dating a person, to have like your basic, whether it's religion or something else, like whether you want to have kids. If you're on opposite ends of the spectrum, that's going to create tension in the relationship at some point, guaranteed, in the future. And it's not going to be great. So you have to figure out like what your needs are. It's not to say that you're judging people of certain values or beliefs or what they want out of life, but it's just a matter of like, okay, it's helpful to have certain shared beliefs or systems in place. It does make it easier, and then the love can grow and build it, rather than just like, oh well, we're in love, we'll find a way to make it work. And sometimes that is a lot harder than it is. And like, my opinion is that love isn't always enough for a relationship. There's a lot of other things at play that you have to factor in, and it takes work. And for some things, that's gonna be, you got to choose your battles, and that would be a battle I don't want to even get in.
yeah, it's just not one that's going to be worth it for the majority of cases. I think another thing that is worth noting is it also matters for any kind of relationship just how heavily people weigh certain things. So, for example, like there was a point in time where I felt like being an atheist was like a strong part of my identity
Mm-hmm.
that like I really needed to connect with and have like out in the forefront. And like when people would even like talk about or reference or mention like anything religious, and this is just pushback from me growing up, but like
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to be around it.
Mm-hmm.
And now like that's eased up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason I bring it up is like it's worth maybe paying attention to, if there are differences, how heavily the people like weigh these things in their life. Because there was a point where like I don't think I could have had any sort of relationship at all with anyone religious,
Mm-hmm.
because just like any mention of it, I'd just be like, I'm not dealing with this. Like, I don't want any part of this. Where like there's also a difference from the other side, whether it's like constantly on, right? Like, oh, you should come to church. Oh, you should do this. Oh, like let's pray about this. Like, let's do this. Or versus just like it's a belief system that somebody has that they kind of like, yeah, they go to church, but they're not talking about it every 2 seconds, or like anyway, that can make a big difference, or at least I've seen from my past, in terms of how well you can sort of mesh up with people, even if you have sort of different belief systems at that level. If both of you are like moderates, or one person just like doesn't really care at all, and the other person's whatever.
Yeah.
Just finding like how those match up can help allow you to like build relationships too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I actually feel like I gain a lot of insight into, I mean, I do have a lot of religious friends, and I don't consider myself an atheist, more agnostic. But with those religious, I even have some Mormon friends, and it's like, oh, that's interesting how they do things. But yeah, same ideas, like they can be like good people and they can be good friends. It all depends on a lot of situations. And it's like what determines whether we can be friends or not is like, as long as they don't try to convert me, or if I'm not trying to deconvert them, we can like have a good friendship and get along just fine. And we don't really get into that. And maybe, if we're curious, we can understand each other's perspectives a little bit more. I have had friends who weren't religious, and they were hanging around some religious people and decided that they wanted to join the religion because it gave them a sense of community and purpose. And that for them, great, awesome. Respect your decision. But that's not everyone's situation. You can share, but I think you have to have like zero expectations, like, oh, just because I'm sharing, I'm trying to get them, hook them in to whatever it is that I'm doing. It's like, leave that off the table, just kind of share like your experience. And if they're really interested, then they can choose to engage or not, and to continue that friendship, whether they choose yes or no, that shouldn't affect it. So when people can do that, then I'm like, yeah, I'm happy to be friends with all sorts of different types of religions. And it's pretty awesome because it expands my pool of understanding of other communities and cultures.
Yeah, it's really just dependent on between the two of you, if you can both just like exercise space and acceptance and lack of judgment around
Right.
some of the stuff. Because yeah, when it's some people have very strong beliefs and are like, if you're not living in line with this, you're a bad person, and that position is really hard to
Yeah,
work with.
definitely super hard. And I can imagine it being, especially, I mean, it would be one thing if it was a friend, but if it was like a parent, that's a whole other thing that I could see being a real hardship for someone. Or maybe it's the reverse, where it's like the child's super religious and the parents I don't know. It could be either scenario, but it can be really hard when it's a very close relationship with someone that you love dearly, and it can be damaging to that relationship. And I haven't been in that situation, so I'm not one to like give advice or anything, but I think it's just like, again, to a lot of things where there's conflicts in relationships, whether it's related to religion or not, it's just to kind of understand, the other person's perspective. And also, if there's a way we can create some sort of mutual goal, like for this relationship, is there a way we can agree to disagree? Is that even possible? Can we just not talk about this? How do we navigate our relationship moving forward? Because if you're going to just berate me for not being religious anymore, then that doesn't really work. So it's a difficult conversation, easier said than done, like a lot of the things we talk about. But I think it's an important conversation to try to work through those differences if you can, when it's someone that's an important relationship in your life.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if this will be of much help, but like it's extra difficult coming if you are on the religious side, because a lot of times what you're looking at is like, well, for example, like this person is going to like be in hell for eternity. Like I'm trying to help them.
Right.
I'm trying, like, so a lot of people, if that's their position, try to like, they end up taking like a very aggressive stance that can be hard to understand if you're on the other side, like if you're on the non-religious side. But it's just like, if you saw somebody right now, like hurting themselves with, I don't know, drugs, right? Just like
Yeah.
binge drinking every single day. You might step in a more aggressive way and be like, you have to stop doing this.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, and it's actually exactly the same for like the religious case or the drugs case. Like, one, the person has to actually want to do the thing you want them to do,
Right.
and two, like usually a bunch of aggression and uh just very like strong opinion type stuff doesn't work. Like it's not effective. So I don't know like what use that necessarily has. I mean, maybe just to help like frame it, but helped me a lot realize like a lot of these people are like being mean or aggressive or judgmental or whatever else because they genuinely think that they're helping me or like saving me or
Right.
drastically improving my life.
Mhm.
I just can't imagine if I went to some uh I don't know, random made
Right.
up country where where everyone is drinking like dirty water and I have a way to give them clean water and none of them want it. You know what I mean? Like it's that kind of
Yeah.
idea or mentality, and I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's why you can get some of those responses, and understanding the background a little bit can help at least process it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point you made because it kind of brings back the point that we had made in the accepting of others podcast that we recently did about, if you're on the receiving end of the nastiness and they're being really mean and nasty, and it's like, get that they are technically coming, they're what they do is right in their mind. They don't think they're doing anything wrong, even though it's like coming off harsh or mean or terrible. It's like they are coming from a place of like they love you so much they don't want you to go to hell. And so they're doing whatever they're doing to do that, even though you don't agree with it. But then at least if you're on the receiving end of it, it might make it easier to understand it because they might not change. And it'll be easier. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but it will be easier to kind of be with them however they are, because it won't be as like you don't have to internalize it as much as they're saying it to be. And it can go the other end too. It's like I think it's a little harder if you're like strongly believe someone is going to hell if they don't follow in suit with this particular religion, to try to understand that this person maybe doesn't believe that they're going to hell, that they are doing what they feel like is best for them, and to have some love, compassion, and understanding from where they're coming from. So it goes both ways. It's like, get that person doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. They're doing what they feel like is right for them, their path, and it's just honoring each other's paths, whatever that might be.
Yep, totally agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Nope, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and spread the happiness in the world. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.